Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the installation stage. I am Matt with the NTCA. I'm a trainer. I've got with me today, we've got Melissa and Rob. The three of us travel the country training and educating people about the proper methods and standards for tile installation. This week we've been working on our module all week. I'm going to go over just what we've done so far so that you guys can be up to speed. We started out our first demo with fixing some substrates. If you look really closely underneath of this tile, we had a big dip, and so we put some wall patch to correct this wall. We also had a concrete floor here, and we had a giant hump that was more than 1/4 of an inch, and so we poured some flowable hydraulic cementitious underlayment. James taught me that, and it's still a mouthful. And so we've been working on this. We've been fixing it. We did some dry pack on the other side of this module. We put some wall mud up. We did a scratch coat, and we screed it off the other side. So we're slowly building this module. Our last demonstration tomorrow, we're going to end up grouting with several different types of grout. We're going to use some unsanded, some sanded, some epoxy, and some single component grout. And we're going to talk about some tips and tricks for all of those different things. But today, we are up to chapter 7 in our reference manual. This manual is produced by the NTCA, and we have a technical crew of people that work really hard to produce this book, and it gets updated on a yearly basis. And so chapter 7, we talk about material-specific installations. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. Rob, I'm going to give you this for 1 second. I got some stuff in my pocket. Everybody has seen these, have they? There we go. Everybody's seen these? Everybody knows what these are? Spacers, he said spacers. Some lippage control devices, right? And so the book, in this book it gives several, those are 3 different kinds. We have one that just slides straight down, another one that has a wedge, another with a spin cap, several different manufacturers, and they're all supporters of the NTCA. They all have their place, and they all have some different functions and features. But this chapter 7, it talks about lippage control devices. And I'm just going to point out a few things that I find very interesting about those. It's like the 3rd paragraph down here. It says the lippage control devices are designed to be used in conjunction with TCNA methods and ANSI standards. These devices are to mechanically assist an installer as the last step of the setting process to mechanically tune the remaining lippage. So I'm going to read one more sentence. These systems are not designed or intended to fix poor craftsmanship that's not approved by industry standards. And then it goes on, and this is one of the really neat features about this book. It gives some different tables, and the whole book is set up in cause, cure, prevention. But in this chapter, it's the do's and don'ts of lippage control. And so I want to point out a few of those to you, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about how to use this. It's a tool, and it can be used improperly. And so a couple of the do's for lippage control devices is always use an appropriate notched trowel to achieve proper coverage. Another do is always engage lippage control device after proper embedment of tile. So we can't just set the tile straight to the wall or straight to the floor and then just tighten or use that wedge to try to embed that. We still have to do the work of a tile installer, and we talked a lot about that yesterday as Chad was setting these tiles here. We trowel our ridges in straight lines, then we shift our tile perpendicular to those trowel lines, and that's how we collapse those ridges. So we talked about all of that yesterday. After we do all of our prep work, we've got a nice flat substrate, we trowel our ridges in straight lines, we collapse our ridges, and then at that point, that's when we're ready to use lippage control devices. We always want to ensure that the corners and the edges of the tile are fully supported with setting material. And the last one of the do's that I want to point out is never use the lippage control system as the tile spacer. So these are all gauged. You said spacers, and there's a misconception there. We want to make sure if we were to use one of those right in here and let's pretend it was an 1/8 inch. We want to use an 1/8 inch spacer in conjunction with a lippage control device that's smaller, because what can happen is the gravity of the tile, the wet tile coming down the wall, it can pinch that, and then the clip breaks off in there. Well, now we got to dig that out. Well, you get a razor knife or a grinder or something like that. We could damage the tile. We could damage what's behind the tile. So it's just another recommendation not to use a spacer as well as the lippage control device. A couple of the don'ts that I wanted to pass out. We got to be careful when we're using those. Most of them are designed for the caps or the wedges to be used over and over again. Well, the more you use them, the more dirty they get, right?
That's right.
So when you get dry thin set on there, then you use them on, say, maybe a polished porcelain, you could really scratch that tile, the stone, whatever tile you're setting, you could end up scratching it. So you want to be really careful in doing that. Another don't is don't expect the lippage control device to correct any improper installation, or poor installation. Don't proceed with any installation that has not been properly prepared. So we've done that already, and that's kind of led us to where we are today. We've prepared everything, and now we could use them properly because we've got a nice flat substrate that we could work off of at this point. But it's taken a lot of work to get there, hasn't it?
It has, yeah.
It has. So today we are going to another big portion of this chapter of the reference manual. It talks about glass, and that's what we're going to be working on today. So I want to point out a few things, and Melissa's going to get set up to set some tile. And we're going to put a feature band over here. We've already pre-cut our glass. We used a glass blade to cut this. But one of the things we really want to be aware of when we're working with glass like this, it has a mesh mount on it, right? Well, if this was a shower, we need to make sure that this mesh and glass combination and the glues that have been used to hold all of this together are going to be acceptable in a wet area. And so, real simple way to test that is we'll just drop that in a bucket of water. You guys have all seen you're running some glass through a wet saw, or any kind of mesh-mounted mosaic through a wet saw. Sometimes they just fall apart, right? Well, we can't use that in the shower floor. It's a wet area, so we want to be really careful about that. While that's soaking for a minute, I'm going to point out what we're going to do. We've got some glass that's getting ready to go up. Melissa is going to burn in her thin set. She's going to apply some thin set to this. But we have already pre-mounted some of our glass. So we started with a full 12 by 12 sheet. We cut it down to this. And then we laid out some sheet membrane on a flat surface. And we applied our thin set to that. Then we took our glass mosaic. We laid it flat into our thin set. And we used a grout float. And we tapped it in, made it really nice and uniform, really pretty. But as you can see that, we don't have any thin set coming up through our joints. And so now that gives us a pretty stable piece that we can work with instead of a piece like this. Everybody can see what this would look like if we were trying to mount that to the wall, right? It's kind of hard to get it up there. A lot easier to work with this way. So we went with this, and I'm going to show you what Melissa's getting ready to install. We went ahead and we made this entire wall. And so now in one piece, we can just set that in there. And it's pretty rigid. The tiles aren't going to move. So the rigidity of this is one benefit, right? But one of the other big benefits is this tile is not the same thickness as the tile that we're working with, right? So if we were trying to take this and it's kind of flopping around and we were trying to set that in there, well, now we've got to build this out. There's no way to build that out and keep this clean. So now we've got a way to separate the grout joints on the outside, and we can put the proper amount of thin set needed to make that look really good. You can go ahead with that, Melissa. I'll give this to you. So, Rob, let's go back to those lippage control devices. I'm going to ask you a couple questions, if that's okay. So one of the things that is a misconception with those lippage control devices is that people think that this tool is meant to bend tile. It's not meant to bend tile, right? So we've all had tile that you've seen that there's a bow in them. little bow. There's a crown in the middle of it maybe. Maybe it's twisted a little bit. Maybe it's warped. But, Rob, I want to ask you, how do we know what's a good tile and what's maybe not a not-so-good tile?
That's a great question. So basically, we have standards for installation, how we actually do stuff, and we kind of have been addressing those all week. But we also have standards for the materials we use, and there's standards for the tile itself. And we find those standards in ANSI A137.1. In there, if we're using a quarry tile, a pressed floor tile, a porcelain tile, a wall tile, there's standards for those. And basically what we know is how those tiles are going to perform if we put them in a given situation. If we know it meets that standard of ANSI A137.1, we know that it's been tested for slip resistance. It's been tested for warpage, like we talked about. You know, just because a tile has some warpage doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything wrong with that tile. That's just part of the manufacturing process. When they're fired, they can become warped. But there is a standard for how much warpage is allowable. Also, it's tested for wedging. It's tested a variety of different ways. And it's used in a lot of our methods that we see in the handbook. Actually, every method we have, if you're not familiar with the Tile Council North American Handbook, they have methods that have a material section in them. And in that material section, it will say, use tile that meets ANSI A137.1. So that's how we know what we're going to get. We know how the tile is going to perform ahead of time because it's been tested.
So that covers what material, Rob? You said a number there. It was 137.1. Yeah. What material does that number cover?
It covers a ceramic tile, porcelain tile, glazed wall tile, mosaic tile, and let's see here, quarry tile. Did I say quarry tile?
There we go. I think you did. Yeah. So I see another number in my notes here, and it's 137.3. 0.3.
Okay, that's our newest, shiniest standard for tile. How many of you guys have installed these big panels, the 1 meter by 3 meter panels? Have any of you guys installed that? No?
Not yet.
Well, hey, we got some guys back here that have. Basically, now we have standards for the panels themselves. These big panels. It was one of our newest standards. And we also have standards for the installation of those panels. And if you guys aren't familiar with the NTCA's regional training program, we've got a great program on installing those according to ANSI standards.
Very good. So I've got one more number. We're going to talk about that in just a second. I'm going to point out one thing that Melissa's doing over here. She gave this drywall, we call it a drink, don't we?
Yeah.
Melissa says, I gave the drywall a drink. That means we're doing two things here. We're getting the dust off of the surface. We're making sure we've got a nice clean surface. But this is it's drywall and cement board on both of these surfaces are very, very dry. And so we're giving them a little drink of water so that when we apply our thin set correctly to this, it doesn't suck the moisture out of our thin set, causing it to dry too quickly and have a weaker bond. Right. So, Melissa, why don't you go ahead and I've got the same thing here, one big piece. Melissa's going to go ahead and put that right here. So we've got ANSI 137.2, and that talks about glass, doesn't it, Rob?
Yeah.
And that's that book right there. That's what most of our ANSI books kind of look like. And so that ANSI standard, again, glass, and that's 137.2. All of these standards break everything down for the manufacturer, giving them things like shade variation. So one tile is different from another, and that goes from like V0 to V4. So the V4 is going to be pretty inconsistent. It's going to have color variation. If you've got a V0, it's going to be almost exactly the same color. And so all of that is described in our ANSI manual. It also talks about all of the testing and things like that. They do destructive testing, how they do those testing. But one of the things that ANSI 137.3 talks about is the definitions of sizes for glass tile. Before we get into that, Rob, why don't you tell us what 137.1 tells us about ceramic, porcelain, quarry tile when it comes to the sizes? How do we define our sizes for those tiles?
Yeah, so basically we have two general categories when we're talking about ceramic or porcelain tile. And we have what's referred to as large format tile. And if you're not familiar with what a large format tile is, it's any tile that has one side that's 15 inches or longer. And then all the other tiles would fall below that. Now, when we talk about these panels, that's a new standard that we just got, and it's defined by size as well. It's defined by being 1 meter in size or larger, then it would fall under that ANSI standard that you mentioned earlier. NTCA 137.3 for the gauge porcelain tile panels.
So then we get in to our glass tile, and those are defined in ANSI 137.2. What size is that? Anybody want to take a guess? It's not a trick question.
Yeah, you got it. What do you say? What size do you think that is? I heard you whisper. Okay.
What is it? So it's about 1/4 of an inch thick, but that's like a 3 by 10, right?
Okay.
And so we have three different. So a 15-inch tile for ceramic and porcelain, that's a large tile.
Right.
For ceramic, porcelain, all of the tiles that fall under ANSI 137.1. But when it comes to glass, anything that is bigger than 9 square inches, so a 3 by 3 tile is a large format. So this right here looks very small to us, but in the glass world, ANSI 137.3 tells us that this is a large format tile. So there's two other categories for glass tile. The next one is just called a mosaic tile, and it's anything from 3/4 up to 3 inches, and that's what this would fall under. And I'm going to point out, I've had this soaking in a bucket of water, it's dripping wet, and it's not falling apart. So we've tested this now, and we know that this is good to go, right? We can put this in a wet area. So simple test that we can do with our mesh-mounted mosaic. So we have one more category of sizes, Rob, and that is called the miniature mosaic tile, and that's anything less than, smaller than 3/4 by 3/4. So really tiny tiles, right? So let's jump over here and check on Melissa one more time. She has installed this piece here, and that falls into our category. We're dealing with two different sizes here. We've got a mosaic glass tile, because then the size of it tells us that. Keep going. And then we've got a large format glass tile here, and it is a large format because of the size. The other thing that we have to be aware of setting these two pieces next to each other is there's, again, a thickness difference, right? So we have to take that into account. So Melissa has picked up another trowel, and she is working away at getting those put in. But Rob, let's talk about some of the challenges with this large format glass tile.
Well, we got to be really careful because they're easily scratched. So we want to think about a couple different things. First, we always want to talk to the manufacturer and make sure that we're putting that tile in an appropriate place. But we also want to make sure that we're using the right type of materials. You know, not all thin sets are designed to be used for glass tile installations, and definitely not all grouts are designed to be used for glass tile.
Let me stop you for one second. Why couldn't I use just any thin set for a large format glass tile?
Well, what
could go wrong?
Well, there's a lot of different things that could go wrong, and one of the things that people don't realize is tiles themselves are not exactly dimensionally stable. And what I mean by that is they can increase in size with changes in temperature and humidity. That's even with a ceramic or a porcelain tile, but with a glass, even more so. So we have to think about that and where we put it and how much flexibility we might have in the mortar, and because some of those higher end mortars actually might not be the right mortar for this because of how much latex it has, and in the curing process they can literally break some tiles. So it's a conversation that you need to have with every manufacturer of glass tile to make sure you're following their directions. One thing that we found is a lot of the glass manufacturers, they have different methods. They have different raw materials. They have different backings. Because of that, they may want you to use a different type of adhesive in a different way. So there's so much of that going on. We always encourage you to make sure and follow the manufacturer's guidelines.
So along those lines, our other coworker, Mark, he has a story, and he got a phone call, and he went and looked at a job for a friend, and they had just had an entire shower built with a glass similar to this. Well, when he walked in, he walked past the thermometer in the house, and he noticed that it was set at 65 degrees. Well, when he walked into the bathroom, there's multiple tiles cracked all throughout that shower. So he turned the hot water on, and he got a thermometer, and he checked that water, how hot it was coming out, and it was 165 degrees. So in a matter of 30 seconds, that shower is going from 65 degrees to 165 degrees, and the tile just couldn't handle it. It was cracking and breaking with that movement that it was doing. So something to really think about, making sure that we're following all of our industry guidelines for something like this. But let's go back to scratching. I'm going to just walk out here for 1 second.
So
This tile's been kind of kicking around in the back. I wasn't planning on showing this, but you can see, just sitting back there, we haven't really moved it a whole lot, but it doesn't take much to scratch that. So then we have to think about the tools that we're using. Maybe an installer's wearing gloves when he's installing and he doesn't really realize that he's got some thin set on his hands. We could very easily scratch a piece like this, and I wouldn't want to live with something scratched up in my shower. So it's going to take a really careful install to work with something like this.
Yeah.
And so Rob has started talking about it already. We need to be really careful when it comes to grout too, don't we, Rob?
Oh yeah, definitely.
So what do we want to look at when we're thinking about grouting?
Well, one of the
like
biggest problems with glass tile that we've seen is, we've used sanded grouts for years, and they work terrific, and they work fine on some glass tiles, but they don't work excellent on all glass tiles. And if our grout has some sand in it, and we have a highly polished glass tile, and the manufacturer doesn't approve a sanded grout, once we spread that sanded grout on there, of course, we're going to create some scratches in that surface. So
that could work like a sandpaper almost, couldn't it?
Exactly like one, yeah. So a lot of the manufacturers will want you to use unsanded grout. It just depends on the particular glass that's being used.
So there's a couple different ways that a glass tile is made. We don't have time to get into all of those. This has got a backing on it, right? But it's still glass. It's see-through, and what gives it the color is what's on the back of the tile, correct? But if we look, you can still see light coming through it. And when I hold this up to the light, what do I see on the back? That tag right there, right? So that's an example of it's see-through. You can see shadow lines and things like that through the tile. So when we look at what Melissa's doing, she's very carefully putting that in there. And yesterday we talked about collapsing our ridges. Well, it's super important to collapse our ridges for the coverage. We want to make sure we're getting the proper coverage. But if we don't collapse those ridges, what are you going to see through there? You're going to see all those trowel lines, right? So super important that, one, we're getting the coverage we need. We want that bond strength. We want all the transfer, all of those kind of things. But we want to make sure we're not seeing any shadows or anything like that.
Exactly.
I've looked at some jobs in the past where an installer did a beautiful job until on the backsplash, and then you turn the under cabinet lights on, and you can see all kinds of lines and all his trowel marks and everything, and it's just not acceptable. It looks beautiful until you turn lights on.
Yeah. It's been a real problem in the industry. That's one of the things, if you guys aren't familiar with the NTCA, we're celebrating 75 years as an association, and you guys need to come down and see our booth. We're right down this way. But some of the great benefits of being a member is we offer technical support to our members, and that's where we run into some of these situations that you've described where we've seen people that have had difficulties in the past. But if you're a tile professional, you ought to really consider coming down and visiting with us. It's a tremendous association, and our reference manual is actually a benefit of being a member. So everyone that signs up for membership gets a reference manual, the stuff we've been teaching on all week.
So, Rob, you're coming back at 3:20 back to this stage. Why don't you give us just a quick highlight of what we're going to be talking about?
I'm going to be talking quite a bit about exterior installations and different things that we need to be talking about, and also about areas where we're going in to do work and looking for potential problems before we get started.
Very good. Well, guys, we thank you for your time. Hope you're enjoying the show.
All right. Thank you, guys.